Hi, welcome to podcast two. This is quite an interesting subject. It's quite a mysterious subject as well. It's an interesting subject if you are impartial and you don't really care about skin color. Then it's fun. Then it's interesting. You know, if people put emphasis on skin color. Now, in the Black Celts, I really try to explain in there, and I don't know if people really get it or not, that the most important thing in the ancient world was kinship, was basically how you were related to somebody, you know. And so it wasn't particular shade, etc. And people don't seem to understand that. And especially with colonialism and all the stuff that has been produced as a result of colonialism, the travelers, the history books, the anthropology books, the creation of an artificial hierarchical so-called ethnic racial structure of who's on top, who's on bottom, etc. None of that is real. It didn't appear in the ancient world. Ancient Egyptians didn't go around thinking that the Canaanites were wonderful. Hell no. They didn't like the Canaanites. They didn't like the Babylonians. Why? Because of even though they shared the same skin color or ethnicities in many instances, no, they didn't get on. They were competing. They were competing civilizations. They had different cultural and different religious beliefs, etc. And so, in that sense, and the Libyans were their neighbors, the people of Meroe and so on, or the people to the south, etc., etc. Obviously, people are not in a vacuum. They're going to fight their neighbors, fight for resources, etc. But none of it was about what particular shade they was. And also, what people seem to forget is with, say, ancient Egypt. The pharaoh, when he wanted um, the products from the ancient land of Punt, somewhere in East Africa, he then says, well, if you can find um, and bring back basically people from what is today the Ituru forest. Um, the word pygmy is used, but that obviously is an old colonial term. But yeah, essentially the people of the Ituru forest, a very small stature people in Central Africa. And he clearly says if you can bring back on your trip, and then he's quite flattering. He says, guard them with your life, provide them with everything they need, etc., etc. So therefore, the people of the Ituru forest, so-called pygmies. Again, I don't like using that term, but you could use the word Twa or other correct terminology. Were highly, highly respected and venerated. So he says that this is more important than the gold of Sinai and the frankincense of Punt. You know, so modern day perceptions of skin color and ethnicity and all that stuff did not make that was not what the ancient world was like at all. You know, now with population movements, you are going to get population movements from one part of the world to the other. In order to understand the Black Celts, for example, you should look at some of the migrations of the Romani people. Now, if you look at the distribution of the Romani people, and you look at those communities that are present in, say, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, in that kind of Central and Eastern Europe, and then you compare them to those that have traveled further west, and those that you find in Ireland and Wales and England and Scotland, etc., you will find that skin color has changed. So when you look at the Romani people in, say, Hungary, or you Google the Romani communities in Romania, etc., they are very deeply brown in color, and they obviously look very 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 Indian, you know, um, and they're definitely of color. They're brown, they're unmistakable. So in a sense, people don't live in a vacuum. People just don't marry within their own group over 1,000 years. No, that doesn't happen. People do absorb different groups and different peoples and etc. With time. Now, what you have to understand is that in the 5th century, and the Anglo-Saxons arrived, the Iron Age population was already firmly established. And you would have had remnants of the Bronze Age population in certain areas, such as Exmoor and some of the Highland areas. And you would have had also some of those of the Neolithic peoples still highly concentrated in maybe places like North Wales, etc., where maybe they didn't do that much mixing and probably had more isolation because of the mountainous inhabitants. And therefore, you find that the blood group O is of higher concentration in North Wales, because they were able to maintain a kind of isolation, etc. But again, people mix anyway. So therefore, if you look at Neolithic burials and then you compare them to the Bronze Age burials, obviously Neolithic burials are quite consistent in what they contain. But then the Bronze Age, you see a transition from inhumation, which is burial, to the practice of burning the body, cremation. And then you get areas where you got both things happening, and obviously exchange of, um, you know, culture. What's interesting is when Beddoe does his book and he travels around Britain. From an anthropological point of view, this is pre sort of industrial migrations. So the big cities now are very, very mixed. And because obviously due to the Industrial Revolution, they needed workers. Workers left the countryside, migrated to the big cities like Birmingham, London, even South Wales saw 500,000 people come, who were not from Wales at all. And many had Breton ancestry and French ancestry, etc. So you had that mass movement due to industrialization. So when you're doing anthropology, you're looking at the isolated regions that haven't seen too much population movement. Everywhere has seen population movement for a fact. The fact that everybody speaks English is a result of population movement of people coming in and actually imposing that language. But even in the Western Isles, etc., that was a excellent sort of area for Beddoe to look at. And he then mentions the Africanoids of Yorkshire, for example, which, yeah, I can actually attest to that. That's very interesting because you seem to have like distinctive populations. And, one is remnants of the Danes and the Swedes that came over in like the 12th century or something. And then you have definite Africanoid type group. And again, the DNA hasn't really been done, even though there were certain people with a particular surname that had a Y DNA haplo A, which you find among the Southwest Kalahari people, the Khojan, and West Africa, etc. So that's kind of interesting if they did a proper research on some of these areas that have been isolated for a while. You probably find quite a variation in the DNA, but you have to look for it. And you also, as a scientist, you'd have to be open to it. What I find interesting is the 1700s description of the Isle of Juba and the other isles of that area, of the Western Hebrides. When you actually read the text, and the references are there, and I've quoted it, he actually talks about people. This is like 300 years ago. He talks about people who are different shades. So he talks about one population is actually light skinned and white, but then he talks about another population that is dark skinned. And he doesn't mean dark skin as in terms of Italian with dark hair and swarthy looks. No, he actually says black skin. And that in itself, you might, again, those that want further evidence, etc., etc. It's quite interesting that the relatively modern DNA analysis found DNA basically representative of um, sub-Saharan Africa, but the scientists didn't pursue it. It was just quite strange, really. They were, it's like, yes, we found that, but well, we don't know what that is. And also the high concentration of the links to Africa. Western Isles was the base of the Fomorians, because if you think of the history, they keep coming from Africa, they keep going to the Western Isles. That was their entire base throughout the annals of the Four Masters, annals of Ireland, and they keep coming back and forth and back and forth, and they keep appearing in every single era, and even into the Christian era, they appear in the chronicles. And this is not just Afrocentrism or whatever. It's actually history. It's history of migrations. It's history of people moving back and forth. And that's what world history is. People don't live in isolation. How do people kind of take this then? Well, in my research and in my sort of travels, when I was doing a book fair once way back, I think people are a little bit more open then. I think people are a little bit more hesitant now. I think times have changed. But back then, people were quite open. People would talk about how their grandfather or their particular surname was associated with being swarthy and things like that. And they thought they had some African blood. And, Granddad, one person said, well, Granddad, he had really hard hair. And I always knew that we had some African ancestry, and that was the lady from Ireland. But one thing that some of these stories are fascinating, because people do tell me stories because I'm a great listener and an empath, and then people just blurt it out. It's just one of those things. That's interesting. I don't judge. It's just oral history. And one person talked about how he was afraid. This was as a kid now. This is in like school, and he said, "Oh my God, he was scared that his sister was going to have a black child." And my response was, "Well, is her husband, partner, is he black?" And then he was was it indignant? He was like, "Of course he is not." I'm saying, "Okay, take it easy." Um, and he said, "No, but it happens, and we know it happens, and it can happen, and she's really worried about it." And that's really interesting, actually, because um, in the book I've got the birthmark which some babies have on the back, on the lower back. They have like a blue black spot, which can be quite huge actually, in some children. And again, that happens in people mainly who are sub-Saharan African ancestry or similar, And I think in Wales and the Welsh people, they're quite used to that because the nurses and doctors actually, it happens at high frequency, and it's quite interesting actually, and people are quite used to it. Yeah, it's a sign of mixed ancestry. In parts of England where they're not used to it, it has caused some controversy where people thought it was bruising, coming from the parent, and so it wasn't. It's actually just a thing that people are born with, and it tends to fade after many years. It just tends to do that, but it's very more frequent in Arab and Black populations, etc. So skin color is quite an interesting thing because if you observe it neutrally and you don't have any preference, you just observe it, you'll find that there's such a huge variation in the shades of the indigenous population. And I think in the book we talk about the experiences. There was a Welsh forum talking about skin color, and one chap said he went to Japan and they did not believe he was British. They said, "No, you are Philippines." It's kind of interesting. And then you got Tom Jones. People always, that's the famous one. Obviously, people, and he himself said to Larry King that he thought that he had some African ancestry somewhere along the line, you know, that's fine, it's there's no homogeneous people in this earth anyway, and so in that sense, um, have those observations, and especially with the maps of Beddoe and certain areas of high concentrations of there's like pre-migrations of darker people, and then there's lighter pockets in the East Anglia and things like that. So yeah, again, it's quite interesting actually. And he says the Africanoid is essentially must have come from Ireland. He says that's the center of the spread of it, which is again is quite interesting. And then you have the Silures. Obviously, the Romans mentioned the Silures. They said the swarthy skin and the woolly hair. Um, and actually, obviously the drawings on the Cardiff Castle are quite interesting. On a lighter note, um, there's one article that I had to quote, made a deep impression on me, and it was in the Guardian newspaper, and it said, "What is white in America and what's black in Russia?" Have a think of that. The answer, he said, was a Caucasian. Now, Caucasia or Caucasus Mountains is a specific region. It's Azerbaijan, it's Georgia, it's Colchis, it's all those sort of that mountainous region that was part of the Soviet Union, and it's on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. So those that are not really aware of geography, there's a whole area there. It's just north of Iran, and it's in the south of the part of the Russian Soviet Union that used to be. And it's obviously, full of lots of different tribes, etc. There's some Turkic speaking tribes. That's where ancient cultures used to be, which is the old Colchians used to live. But anyway, the article said, what is white in America and black in Russia. So he was driving, he was in a taxi in Moscow, and he obviously was talking to the taxi driver who's a Muscovite, and the Muscovite was talking about um, uh, the immigrant population that had settled in Moscow recently, you know, and the actual Muscovite was saying how there are too many black people in Moscow, and the journalist from the Guardian said, "Excuse me, I kind of don't see any." And then he then had obviously a longer conversation, and then obviously the Muscovite um, obviously meant people from the Caucasus Mountains, and he goes, "We refer to them as black," you know, and that's really interesting actually, because for someone from Moscow, Russia, um, would not want to be called a Caucasian. So that name in America, however, signifies someone who's white. And Americans use that word all the time. If you watch those movies, you know what I mean? Yes, we have a report, and they will always say it's a black male, or they'll say it's a Caucasian, or whatever it is. And obviously, it's an artificial definition, created about 150 years ago. And the interesting thing is, somebody from Moscow will say, "Oh no," you know, they see as a something that is totally different to how an American sees it, or someone in Western Europe. So it's interesting how words have different meanings in different places. You know, as in America, it's born as a badge of well, I won't say pride. It's like a badge of it opens doors for you, doesn't it? Because obviously America is hierarchical structure based on slavery. There was racism. There are glass ceilings for people of color, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not going to go on about that. But obviously, the term, please tick this box, are you Caucasian? And that's it. You can be from Albania, you can be from Scotland, you can be from Malta, and you just tick that box, and then you're like, okay, I'm in. And then there's a long list of others, I mean, are you Puerto Rican? Are you Sudan, Arab, Black Arab? Are you, do you know what I mean? So it's like, this is interesting, you know. But it's interesting. There's different perceptions. And also, on a humorous note, I was waiting at Heathrow Airport, and I was waiting with somebody of African descent, just as I'm of African descent, or African, obviously. And she was obviously it's boring when you're waiting at Heathrow Airport, and you just have to people watch. And it's interesting listening to her. She said, the people, bunch of people got off the plane, etc., and so on. And the conversation was quite interesting. The conversation that people have about ethnicity is interesting because she was saying they're not white. Nope, they're not white. No, another group of people you would presume would think they're white. And then they're not white. Nope, 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 nope. And then a group of people who are very tall, German looking, very broad, rugged features. She said, no, they look German. They probably are white. You see, so it's quite interesting how people from um, other nations, when they migrate to other nations, can actually see the differences within the populations. But it becomes a taboo within those populations because everybody is collectively regarded as white and it's not questioned. Whereas, to be honest, everybody is mixed. Hell yeah, everyone's mixed. There's no pure people on this earth, you know. But because of racism, there's a hierarchy. So those that can pass for white over the centuries obviously would have tried to do so because they get rewarded in terms of housing, they get rewarded in terms of jobs, etc. And those who are visible, I don't use the word visible minority, but visible people of color, obviously are gonna, when they're in a Western society, whether it's America, Australia, whatever, they kind of will have, more problems, and it depends on the actual locality as well. So if you look at someone on the Welsh football player Ryan Giggs, Ryan Giggs' granddad was from Sierra Leone, and Ryan Giggs is quite, melanated or tinted, yeah. He's not very very dark, but then he's not light. But because he's obviously from Wales, he's kind of a similar color to everybody else. Whereas if he was brought up in East Anglia, he'd probably have suffered a lot of discrimination and racism because East Anglia is very, very, very light skinned, high amount of Scandinavian sort of pale population. So when you talk to people, they're aware of that and they confide in you and they say, yes, I went to work in such and such a place or such and such a district and it was difficult. So they came back to Wales. And a lot of people have actually said that, which is quite interesting when you get to know people. So there is um, a very mixed population. Um, and you got genetic pockets of E1B1, for example, in the Midlands, which hasn't been explained. You got a high concentration of E1B1 in North Wales, again, hasn't been explained. And then you feel that the R1B male haplogroup obviously is the majority um, male DNA lineage in Western Europe and Britain and Ireland. However, you still have that link with Africa and the West African Hausa and so on, who are R1, B1, V88. So it'd be very interesting to look at the research of surnames and then look at a table and then trying to find the distribution of those pockets of different DNA. That'd be good. That's a good little model for someone to do a research. Somebody listening to this could do like a PhD thesis on that. You know what I mean? Because I was obsessed with like surnames and DNA, and that's very good because you can't really hide the results. So you look at all the DNA sort of names, you look at the name and then the DNA that they had, and then if you look at surnames and DNA, which I'm gonna do hopefully in another edition of Black Celts, so volume 2, or something similar. gonna want to publish that because it's very fascinating. You have, it was like the surname Bray, Bray, seemed to have quite a lot of E1B1, like sub-Saharan, and that was in Ireland. So it's kind of interesting. What's the story there? Because obviously surnames have stories, which is very interesting. And connecting that with the DNA, and then do they have an ancestral memory of what their folk memory says they were from? So again, I mean, if you're not like, if you're impartial and you're not creating a fake hierarchy, which is what unfortunate Eurocentric scholars do, you know, if you just see it as just facts, just interesting stories, human beings migrating from one area to another, marrying another group, creating a hybrid culture that then eventually gets changed again centuries later. That's how it is. So um, people have never lived in isolation. People were trading with each other. And finally, to end this, the key to the issue with the Celts is there was no, with the Celts, and in other words, Hallstatt and the Central European model, which now is really just not correct. What you really had was you had the Phoenicians and you had people from the South Mediterranean doing incredible trade into Central Europe. And so with the trade in what they call luxury products. So those luxury products were being traded, into Italy, into the Alps, and into southern Germany. And those local tribes then became incredibly wealthy. They became incredibly, and therefore it created buildings, it created new sort of social structures, etc. But it was hybrid because it was Phoenician people and Etruscans coming in, trading, etc. Because of trade, yeah, the hybrid Phoenician Celtic language came into existence. So therefore, when we look at Irish, for example, you've got so many Canaanite words, so many Semitic words, and you've got words from that are related to other Hamito-Semitic um, languages. But the biggest link is definitely Canaanite. Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and Canaanite, they're so similar. But it's not just about the similarity or whatever. It's actually understanding that the trade that happened from the southern Mediterranean, from the Etruscans, from the Phoenicians, from those people, waves coming from northern Africa into the Po Valley, into Liguria, into the Alps, and then in southern Germany, you had these luxury goods being there for the first time, and then an explosion of trade. And so when people are trading with each other, the languages change. And that's why the Irish, Scottish, and Welsh languages, as they evolved, so Proto Celtic, was deeply influenced by Hamo-Semitic traders and settlers. That's even without thinking about the Neolithic population and all that kind of stuff. So even if we forget that theory and we say that trade alone creates an incredible hybrid population and a hybrid language and a new culture. And it's just like hip hop and it's just like K-pop now. We've got K-pop now, It transcends culture. People are dancing like BTS now. But then BTS are probably listening to Michael Jackson before that. This is how the world has always been, things are reinvented again and again. But because new ideas are reaching different places, those ideas come in waves, and become certain things become popular. So you'd have certain luxury goods really entering Central Europe and modifying that area forever, and then you get the expansion of the hybrid language. So because people are trading, they will learn the language even though they're not Celtic, even though they're something else. So Britain wasn't Celtic, but because of trade, they actually adopted the language. So the previous language which was related to Hamiso-Semitic, eventually becomes hybridized when that Indo-European element is, comes into contact with through trade, and then they take that with them as they migrate. Um, and so it wasn't a migration of waves of Celts coming; it was actually a migration of ideas, migration of luxury goods, and lingua franca becoming a kind of Phoenician, Canaanite mixed with some kind of Indo-European language, hybridized, and then that became the language of trade. Just like United States of America, the English languages, you know, has replaced many languages, etc. And just like West Africa, for example, many countries adopted French as the lingua franca, etc. Or Ethiopia, where people adopted the Oromo language because of that explosion of Oromos in the 1600s, covering vast areas of Ethiopia. Then people started learning that language and because they started trading. So trade absolutely affects culture. As Bob Quinn said, he said that the Americans brought Dallas, i.e., Dallas, the old 90s kind of show from America with Larry Hagman. He goes, they bought Coca-Cola, and he said, I wonder what the people from North Africa brought, and what kind of legacy did they bring? And that's what his research was all about as well, because and some of the answers were actually like gold. Gold was introduced, coins, etc., trade. It all comes back to trade. Trade creates new cultures, new relationships, and new folk stories. So again, hopefully join me on another podcast where I can tell a few stories behind the Black Celts. Thank you.